Amelia had always seen her life as a work of art. From a young age, she learned that every experience, every emotion could be captured with a brushstroke. Whether it was the delicate tones of joy or the deep, brooding shadows of regret, it was all part of her canvas. She had lived her entire life like that, always detached from the chaos of reality, filtering it through her art. It was a Wednesday evening when it all started to unravel. The city lights outside her studio flickered in the fading twilight. Amelia stood at the large easel in the corner of the room, her brush hovering over the canvas. The city was alive, and so was the art she was creating. But tonight, it felt different. There was a rawness in the air, a tension she couldn't shake. She had always been focused, but for the past few weeks, her attention had been elsewhere. Her eyes kept drifting back to the new email in her inbox, the subject line stark and unavoidable: invitation to the exclusive exhibit. The email was from an influential curator in the city's art world, an opportunity that most artists would kill for. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to respond immediately. Something gnawed at her insides, something she couldn't explain. She was tired of pretending to be the cold, calculated artist she'd worked so hard to become. And then there was him. It was only a few months ago that Amelia met Damien at an art gallery opening. He was the type of person who didn't seem to care about the rules. An enigmatic force in the art world, Damien had a presence that was hard to ignore. He was charming, handsome, with a quiet confidence that didn't need to be shouted. He didn't seem to try. He simply was. She wasn't interested at first. She had enough distractions in her life. She wasn't looking for anything more. But there was something about the way Damien looked at her that made her pause. Something about his attention that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their first conversation had been casual, just talking about art, the city, and the creative process. He asked her questions she didn't usually hear. He made her think deeper about her own work, her motivations, but she knew from the start that it was more than just art. There was an energy, a spark between them that Amelia couldn't deny. It was dangerous. That night after the gallery closing, Damien had walked her to her car. His hand brushed against hers as they said goodbye, and for the first time in years, Amelia had felt a rush of something she hadn't expected. A week later, she found herself standing in front of his apartment building, her heart racing in anticipation. She had told herself she wouldn't let it happen. She wouldn't let him affect her. But there she was, allowing herself to be swept up in his world, a world that felt like a seductive, magnetic force. When he opened the door, the way he looked at her told her everything. "I didn't think you'd come," he said softly. Amelia just smiled, unsure of how to respond. She had crossed the line now, and there was no turning back. The affair with Damien quickly escalated. What had started as late-night conversations about life, art, and philosophy soon morphed into something much more complex. They would meet in secret, their bodies tangled together in a way that felt almost dangerous, passionate but fleeting, like a storm that burned brightly and then disappeared. For the first time in her life, Amelia felt fully alive, completely undone. Damien made her feel wanted, cherished, in a way that had always seemed like a distant dream. But there was always a tension in the air, a reminder that this was not a fairy tale, not a love story. It was an escape, an addiction. For weeks they were inseparable. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but it wasn't just physical. There was something deeper, something she couldn't name. It was the way he made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. He made her see life in a different light, one where the lines between reality and art blurred until they were indistinguishable. But with every encounter, the guilt crept in. Tom, her husband of 5 years, had no idea. He trusted her implicitly, always patient, always understanding. He supported her career, her eccentricities, her solitary nature. Tom was the steady one, the calm in the storm. But lately, that calm felt suffocating. He didn't see her anymore. Not the way Damien did. Not the way anyone did. And so, she lied. To Tom, to herself. She told herself it was just a phase, that it didn't mean anything. But every time she saw Damien, every time he touched her, she knew it wasn't true. She was living in those moments, leaving the woman who was married to Tom far behind. Amelia began to lose herself. The boundaries between her personal life and her art became more and more difficult to distinguish. Her paintings, once so full of vibrant color and intricate detail, began to darken. She painted with her emotions now, pouring out the pain and confusion she couldn't articulate in words. The exhibit was getting closer. The emails with the curator had been exchanged. The world was starting to take notice of her work, but Amelia felt nothing but emptiness inside. She had been given the chance of a lifetime, and yet it felt hollow, like something she had stolen rather than earned. The night of the exhibit opening, everything came to a head. The gallery was filled with patrons, critics, and potential buyers, all admiring her work with the same kind of detached reverence that they always showed artists who had made it. Amelia stood near the entrance, greeting guests, but her eyes were fixed on one painting. The Veil, the piece that had come to represent the confusion and torment of the last few months. The painting was haunting, with swirling, chaotic strokes of dark red and black that seemed to pull the viewer in, almost suffocating them. She had painted it after her last encounter with Damien. It was a symbol of everything she had lost, everything she had given up. As the night wore on, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Damien stood there, looking as captivating as ever, dressed in a suit that made him look even more dangerous than usual. His eyes were locked on hers, and for a brief moment, the rest of the gallery seemed to fade into the background. "Your work is incredible," he said softly, his voice low and intimate. "But this one? It's you, Amelia. It's everything you've been trying to hide. The art of deception." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to be this way." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can't stop now. We're already here. You've already crossed the line." Amelia felt the air grow heavier between them. She knew what he was implying, knew that his influence over her had already gone too far. But as she looked at him, the guilt in her chest mingled with something else, something she couldn't deny. She had never felt more alive than she did in those stolen moments with him. She had never been more herself than when she was with him. "Amelia," Damien whispered, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "What are you going to do now?" She looked at him, her breath caught in her throat. Everything she had built was at risk. Everything she had worked for, everything she had promised herself was about to come undone. She wasn't just losing Tom, she was losing herself. As the crowd around them continued to admire her work, Amelia realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could choose to walk away from Damien, to face the destruction of her own choices, or she could give in, let the chaos consume her, and continue living in the world that he had created for her. The weight of Damien's gaze pressed heavily on Amelia. It was as if everything that had been building between them, unspoken yet undeniable, had reached its apex. For a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. The gallery buzzed around them, voices blending into a distant hum, but all she could hear was her own pulse, the quick beat in her chest. She could feel the presence of his body close to hers, the heat radiating from him as though they were the only two people in the room. "What are you going to do now?" The question hung in the air, taunting her. She knew the answer. She had known it for months, even if she refused to acknowledge it. The question wasn't whether she could walk away from him. It was whether she could ever return to the life she had before him. Her hands shook as she reached for her glass of wine, desperately trying to regain some sense of control. Her fingers brushed the rim, but the movement felt hollow. She couldn't focus on the wine. She couldn't focus on anything. All she could see was him, standing in front of her, with that quiet, knowing expression, as if he had already won. "You're not the woman I thought I knew," he said, his voice low and almost tender. His gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the challenge in his words. Amelia tried to hold his gaze, but it felt like she was sinking. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to snap at him, tell him that he didn't know anything about who she really was, but the truth was undeniable. In the last few months, she had lost herself in him. She had let herself be consumed by the passion he offered, by the dark, seductive world he had created around her. He had pulled her in with a confidence that matched her own artistic ambitions, and now she was caught, both in her own choices and in his web. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice shaky. The confession felt like a betrayal, even though it was the truth. She hadn't asked for this whirlwind of emotions, this toxic attraction. She hadn't asked for the way he had slid into her life, making her question everything she thought she knew about love, about herself. Damien stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. It was both comforting and suffocating at once. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her heart race, even as her mind screamed at her to walk away. But she didn't. She couldn't. "Come with me," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, as if it were the only possible course of action. For a brief moment, Amelia hesitated. Her mind flashed back to Tom, the life she had built with him, the quiet stability of their relationship. But that life felt like a distant memory now, one that had faded away the moment she had allowed Damien into her world. She had been searching for something that had been missing, and he had offered it to her in a way that Tom never had. But at what cost? Amelia swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the guests mingling around her. This moment, this dangerous pull between them, was so starkly different from anything she had ever known. It wasn't just the affair that was out of control. It was her own life, the direction she had chosen. She had started out as an artist, a woman who found solace and meaning in her work. But now, her work had become a reflection of her inner turmoil. The brush strokes, chaotic and dark, echoed her own confusion. Her inability to let go of the man who had become both her muse and her poison. "I can't just leave," she said, more to herself than to him. This is my life." His lips curved into a slight, knowing smile. But there was no humor in it. "Your life," he repeated softly. "This isn't your life, Amelia. Not anymore. You gave that up the moment you let me in." Her breath caught in her throat. He was right, in a way. Everything she had thought she was building, the stability, the art, the future, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had abandoned herself, left her integrity behind in exchange for something she couldn't even define. Damien's hand reached for hers, and despite every warning in her mind, she took it. She led her through the crowd, away from the noise, the compliments, the polite art patrons who all admired her work, without ever truly seeing her. They stepped into a back hallway, the air colder, the lights dimmer. She felt the sudden shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer just a gallery opening. This was something else, something dangerous. "I've never met anyone like you, Amelia," Damien said, his voice low, almost intimate. "You're an artist, yes, but you're so much more than that. You're unfinished, but you've always wanted someone to finish you." She felt his words like a punch in the gut. The vulnerability in them took her by surprise. But also, in a strange way, it exhilarated her. This was what she had been searching for, wasn't it? To be seen fully, to be wanted, not for her art, not for her perfect exterior, but for something deeper. Amelia closed her eyes, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. She didn't know if it was the wine or the heat of his gaze, but for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. But then, as if the universe itself was pulling her back, she heard a voice in the distance. "Amelia?" Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, and there, standing at the edge of the hallway, was Tom. His face was a mixture of confusion, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite place. "Tom?" she whispered, as though seeing him for the first time in ages. The guilt, thick and suffocating, flooded her chest, making her feel like she was choking. Damien looked at her, then to Tom, the realization hitting him like a wave. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "Is this who you really are, Amelia?" he asked, his voice sharp now, laced with anger. "A woman torn between two men, unable to decide what she wants?" Tom's eyes widened, his face going pale as the truth settled in. He had known something was wrong. He had sensed it, but now it was out in the open. There was no going back from this. Amelia stood frozen in the hallway, the two men she had betrayed standing on opposite sides of her, and for the first time in months, she felt the weight of her choices crash down on her. She wasn't an artist anymore. She wasn't the woman who had always controlled her emotions, her choices, her life. She was just a woman, lost in the middle of a storm, unable to find her way out. Tom took a step forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Amelia, please, don't do this. Don't choose him over us." Her heart shattered at the sound of his voice. The love she had once felt for him was still there, buried under the guilt, the lies, the passion of what had happened with Damien. She wanted to run to him, to make it right, but something inside her told her it was too late. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant for any of this to happen." But he shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "It's over, Amelia. You've already chosen." And with that, he turned and walked away. Damien stepped closer to her, his hand still reaching for hers, but this time there was no warmth in his touch. It felt cold, as if it had been weighed down by the very choices they had made. "You should have walked away," he said quietly. "But now you have to live with it." Amelia watched Tom leave, and as the sound of his footsteps faded, she realized something. This wasn't just the end of her relationship with him. This was the end of everything. Of the art she had once known, of the life she had built, and of the woman she thought she was. Damien might have won, but in the end, Amelia had lost herself. The echo of Tom's retreating footsteps seemed to reverberate in the hallway long after he had disappeared from view. Amelia stood there, frozen, her heart breaking in slow, deliberate beats. She had watched him walk away, the man she had promised to love forever, and now, the gallery's hum, the whispers of art enthusiasts, the distant clink of champagne glasses all seemed distant, like they were happening in another world, a world she no longer belonged to. Damien was still standing there, his presence towering over her. But now, it felt suffocating. He had been the catalyst of her destruction, the one who had awakened something in her that she didn't even know existed, something raw and uncontrollable. And yet, in the shadow of her crumbling life, she realized that it was not just him who had pulled her down into the depths. It was her too. Damien reached out and gently lifted her chin, his fingers light but insistent, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were darker now, colder than she had ever seen them before, as though he was already measuring the distance between them. But his voice was soft, almost compassionate, as if he were speaking to someone else entirely. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his tone low, thick with something like regret or maybe victory. She wasn't sure. Amelia opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. She had no explanation, no defense, nothing. She could feel the tears pressing behind her eyes, but she held them back, unwilling to let him see the weakness she felt creeping in. He had already taken so much from her. Did she really need to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken? "I didn't mean for any of this," she finally whispered, the words feeling thin and fragile in her throat. She didn't even know who she was talking to anymore. Damien. Tom. Herself. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped closer, so close that she could feel the warmth of his body against hers. His fingers curled around her wrist, gently pulling her back toward him, as though trying to close the distance that now lay between them. But there was no comfort in his touch now. She realized, with a strange mix of sadness and clarity, that Damien had never been about comfort. He had been about power, about control, about making her feel something, anything, so that she would lose herself in the whirlwind of it all. "Neither of us can walk away from this," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "You and I both know that." For a moment, Amelia stood there, her chest tight, unable to move. The quiet buzz of the gallery's festivities felt like a distant hum, nothing but noise in the background of her life. All she could hear now was the sound of her own breath, ragged and uneven, and the soft, steady rhythm of Damien's heartbeat. "I don't want this," she said, though the words felt foreign. They were a lie, and she knew it. She wanted him. She had wanted him the entire time, even as she stood on the edge of destruction, watching everything she had worked for slip through her fingers. Damien leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You've been wanting this for a long time, Amelia. Ever since I walked into your world." His words hit her like a slap to the face. He was right. She had let him in, let him break down the walls she had spent years building. She had allowed herself to get lost in him. She had chosen this path, and now it was too late to take it back. But what was the alternative? To go back to Tom, to the life she had known, the one that had never made her feel truly alive? Amelia closed her eyes, taking in a shaky breath. She wanted to scream at Damien, to push him away, but a part of her didn't want to. A part of her didn't want to fight anymore. She had already lost so much, so why not lose herself completely? A sharp cough broke the moment, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. Amelia and Damien both turned toward the source of the interruption, and her heart clenched when she saw him standing there. Tom, he had returned. The shock of seeing him again, standing at the far end of the hallway, his eyes wide with disbelief, made her stomach twist. She hadn't expected him to come back. At least, not like this. Not after the words they had exchanged earlier. His jaw clenched as he looked at her, then at Damien. His posture was tense, his hands balled into fists at his sides. But there was something in his gaze, something raw and vulnerable, that made Amelia's heart break all over again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew those words would never be enough to undo the damage. Tom didn't speak at first. Instead, he just stood there, watching her, his face unreadable. The hurt in his eyes was unmistakable, a mixture of shock and heartbreak that he hadn't even tried to hide. Amelia had known this was coming, but seeing it, witnessing it in the flesh, was a different kind of pain. Damien, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped back slightly, his expression guarded. He knew this was his cue to leave, and yet there was something almost triumphant in his eyes as he looked at Tom, then back at Amelia. He wasn't worried. He knew exactly how to handle this. He always did. "Tom," Amelia said, her voice cracking as she spoke, "please, I never meant for you to find out like this." Tom finally broke his silence. His voice was low, strained, as if the very act of speaking pained him. "No, you didn't mean for any of this, did you, Amelia? But it happened, and now I'm standing here watching you with him. I don't even know who you are anymore." The words hit her like a hammer. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had betrayed him, betrayed everything they had been, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. Damien glanced at Tom and then at Amelia, a flicker of something like contempt passing over his face. But he didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Amelia standing there, her heart in pieces, torn between the man she had once loved and the one who had consumed her completely. As Damien disappeared into the crowd, Amelia turned back to Tom. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at her, still trying to make sense of everything. She could see the fight in his eyes, the desire to stay and fight for their relationship, but also the resignation, the understanding that it might be too late. "I'm sorry," she repeated, the words feeling hollow. "I don't know how to fix this." Tom took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling. His eyes softened, but there was no warmth in them now, no trust. He was looking at her like she was someone else, someone he didn't know. And in a way, she was. "I don't know either, Amelia," he said softly. "I don't know if we can fix this." Amelia stood there, the two men who had once defined her life, now standing apart, their paths diverging in front of her. She had loved Tom once. She had felt safe with him, loved him in a way she never thought she could love anyone. But with Damien, it was different. It wasn't love, it was an obsession, a need, a force she couldn't control. And now she had lost them both. The art of deception had worked for a while, but it had come at a price. The canvas that had once been her life was now fading, each brushstroke of guilt and regret taking her further away from who she had been. And she wasn't sure there was any way back.